It was Mackenzie's idea to go camping. In fact, most things we do start out as one of her ideas. Neither of us were exactly outdoor enthusiasts, but we had both grown up in rural towns and did our share of hiking and fishing growing up. So I wasn't exactly daunted by the idea of spending a few days in the woods, but I wasn't excited either. School has just let out for spring break, and after another semester of getting kicked by midterms, it was very tempting to give in to my body's desire for a few days of uninterrupted sleep. Uninterrupted sleep, unfortunately, was not Mackenzie's idea of a good time. She had been suggesting the idea to me for weeks beforehand, and I had always brushed her off by claiming I had other things coming up. But by the time the break rolled around, I had run out of excuses, and she had already prepared everything with me in mind. So it was decided we left on Sunday. Despite Mackenzie making me wake up before the sun even rose to get on the road, I found myself in a strangely good mood. I had spent most of the previous day either eating or napping, the most uninterrupted rest I had gotten since Christmas. We drove up from Bakersfield, her truck bathed in the light of the desert sunrise. At first we spoke of classes and tests, and then of a camping spot that she had found in the forests of the Sierra Nevada. It wasn't actually a campground, she informed me. It was something called dispersed camping, which means you register a permit with park services and then you pitch a tent wherever you like, which also meant no water, heat, or electricity. Leave it to Mackenzie to make sure everything we do is to the extreme. By the time the desert scenery had bled into the browns and greens of the Sierra foothills, I had rifled through all of our packs. I trusted Mackenzie with the planning, but now that I realized we were going to be a little more off the grid than previously anticipated, I just wanted to make sure. We each had our own private tents and sleeping bags, along with a few days' supply of food and water. Cooking utensils, first aid kits, and other items were divided up between our two packs, which were already stacked high enough to peek over my head when it was on my back. I recognized landmarks near Sequoia National Park and Kings Canyon, but Mackenzie took us farther north, and I lost track of the terrain. She turned on a trail that led us deeper into the mountains and pulled over when it ended at the foot of a hill. "I was out here last week looking around for spots," she said, opening the car door. "If we hike around this hill here, there's a sort of little valley with a lake at the bottom where we can set up." I groaned a little as I shrugged on my pack. "How long a hike?" I asked. I took a step forward and winced at the sound of pots clanging together. Next time I'm packing my own bag. "Maybe half an hour or so." A little cardio never hurt anyone, I guess, and I bumped the pack higher before tightening the hip strap, trying to keep the weight from dragging on my shoulders. Mackenzie was right. Just around the hill, the terrain dropped dramatically towards a lake at the center of the valley. Almost like a caldera, I just doubt that there used to be any active volcanoes around these parts. Mackenzie led the way down, through some steep ground where I was worried I might slip and roll all the way down into the lake, but the firm dirt made good footing and the trees made good handholds. Mackenzie suddenly stopped. I heard the rushing of water. I peeked around her shoulder and saw that in front of us laid a stream, almost a small river if I was being generous. It also led towards the lake, but a bend in the trail meant we had to cross it to continue. The snows up in the mountains must have begun to melt because the stream had swelled in size and the log that laid across it was already submerged by a thin layer of water. "Only a few more minutes of walking after we cross this," Mackenzie said, nudging the log with the toe of her boot. It seemed sound enough, despite being underwater. "I'd watched out," I said, leaning over the stream. There were tiny ripples at the surface, but it looked placid. They say that streams like these only look calm on the surface. Mackenzie snorted out a laugh and stepped onto the log. "Yeah, that's why I don't plan on swimming in it." She began to shimmy across, and after a few moments I shrugged and joined her. It wasn't a far crossing, maybe 20 feet, and we were making fast progress, but in the end, it was always the little things that got you. A little more than halfway across, Mackenzie's foot slipped, and she leaned forward to regain her balance. Her sleeping bag, tied to the top of the pack, broke loose from one of its straps, fell forward over her shoulder until it was caught mid-air by the remaining strap. That little momentum was enough. Mackenzie tottered for a split second and then fell. I was right. The current was fast. She reached out a hand to grab onto the log, but by the time she resurfaced, she was already too far downstream. I began to scramble across, in hopes of getting to the other side before she was pulled too far away. I guess some luck was on our side that day. The stream was fast, but it wasn't deep, and it couldn't pull her under. Some 20 yards downstream, her pack had caught onto a fallen tree, and that was how I found her, gasping and sputtering. Maybe it was a combination of the adrenaline and the ice-cold water. But by the time we stumbled to the spot where we were going to set up camp, Mackenzie was laughing hysterically. She had rolled her ankle during her stint in the stream and was limping on ahead of me, while I stumbled after her with her pack, in addition to mine, strapped to me. "I don't plan on swimming in it," Mackenzie giggled from ahead of me, and then I fell right into the damn thing. Even I had to smile at that. Despite being stuck with around 60 pounds of supplies, maybe I did need some more action in my life. Now I really had a story to tell when I got back home. It was just about noon by the time we finished pitching our tents and hung our wet clothes out to dry. Mackenzie began digging a fire pit to cook our lunch, as we had neglected to bring a jet boiler. I took this moment to take stock of my surroundings and was pleasantly surprised that we found a genuinely beautiful spot to set up camp. We were by the edge of the lake, where the mountains flattened out and the tree line ended a few yards from the shore. After being in school dorms for nearly a year, the amount of the quiet was almost uncanny, the only sounds being the wind in the trees and the waves breaking against the sand. It was alluring, like a lullaby. Mackenzie cussed beside me. I looked over. She was struggling to get the fire going. Her hands shook as she tried to light another match. A small pile of used ones already lay by her knee. "Let me try," I said, sitting up. "She almost got pulled away by a stream an hour ago," I reasoned. "Sometimes the shock only hits you after the adrenaline has gone away." I had more luck, and after the fire got going, the rest of the afternoon and evening went by pleasantly. I rummaged through my pack and found that Mackenzie had packed marshmallows and chocolate for s'mores. I tossed the packaging on the ground and jokingly said, "I see my pack was so heavy because it was full of all these essential supplies." Mackenzie grinned and then shrugged innocently. She grabbed the package of marshmallows and began unceremoniously shoving them into her mouth. "Aren't those for cooking?" I asked, and Mackenzie looked up at me with a very well-acted look of confusion. I laughed. When the sun set, both of us agreed to retire early so we could wake up at sunrise to explore the area in the morning. I shimmied into my tent and pulled the zipper closed. I checked my watch one last time before letting the sound of waves lull me to sleep. I woke up in the dark, and something was wrong. The air was heavy, and my skin was clammy as if I had just broken a fever. Nothing was disturbed inside my tent, and the outside was still quiet. There was nothing reasonable that could have caused this feeling. It's hard to explain. Thinking back on it, the only conclusion I could come to is that we, as a species, are old. Younger than the forests and mountains, of course, but still old enough, and in that time we have seen many things. You can conjure up your life experiences and logic all you want, but deep down there is a part of you that simply knows when something is wrong, and in that moment I knew. Suddenly, there was a light tapping on the flap of my tent, and then a voice. "You need to come outside," Mackenzie whispered, and she sounded terrified. I took a few deep breaths and clenched my pocket knife in a white-knuckle grip. In a flurry of motion, I unzipped the flap and stuck my face outside. I came face to face with Mackenzie. Her hair was disheveled, and she looked to be on the verge of tears. I opened my mouth, but she clamped a hand down over my lips and motioned for me to be silent. For a few moments, neither of us spoke, and the only sound to be heard was our heavy breathing as we stared at each other. But then Mackenzie's eyes slowly drifted away from mine, towards the lake. I saw her pupils dilate until I could barely see the color of her eyes. "Run," she whispered. I didn't have time to question her. She leaped up and sprinted into the woods. I didn't waste a second before getting up and following her. The two of us crashed through the undergrowth. Perhaps Mackenzie was clearing the way in front of me because it was strangely easy. Maybe I was simply scared. "Mackenzie!" I called to the shape in front of me, but no answer, only the sound of her breathing and the cracking of branches. "Mackenzie, what's going on?" Still nothing. And then the adrenaline in my system began to run out, and suddenly I stopped. It was dark, almost too dark to see. We had left all our lanterns back at the camp, and the canopy practically blocked out any moonlight. We'd been running for several minutes, but there were no cuts on me or branches clinging to my hair. It was like I hadn't been forcing my way through the trees at all. It was as if they were welcoming me. Ahead of me, Mackenzie had stopped too. She was standing still, and I couldn't hear her breaths anymore. "We have to keep going," she said, her voice strangely level. "Not until you tell me what's going," I called back. Mackenzie shook her head. It was even darker where she was standing, and I couldn't make out her face, but behind her was some sort of clearing, and the light coming through silhouetted her against the trees. "We're almost of the forest," she said, and I saw that she was right. There was nothing I would not give to be out of this god-forsaken forest. But no, it couldn't be. It took us half an hour to hike here, and that was downhill. The forest could not end here. I was being reeled in, like a fish chasing a worm on a hook. Mackenzie turned around, and as she did, she took a step towards me, an impossibly huge step. She had been several yards ahead, and now we were almost face to face. I ran. I turned around and I ran like I was being chased by the devil himself. If the trees had been welcoming on the way in, they were the opposite on the way out. Branches caught on my clothes and cut my arms and face. I kept on stumbling over tree roots and rocks, but I was undeterred. Behind me, I heard her running after me, but it didn't sound like Mackenzie any longer. It sounded like it had 4 legs. I wasn't even tempted to turn around. I was too focused on running, and my eyes stayed locked on the light that marked the end of the tree line. I practically dove onto the beach and fell hard onto my hands and knees. I felt the bones in my wrist crunch at the landing. I continued to crawl until I was almost in the water before I turned around. There was nothing there. I wasn't far from our tents, and I watched in wonder as Mackenzie's tent unzipped from the inside and she stepped out. "What are you doing?" she asked groggily. I ran towards her and practically tackled her into a hug. It was thanks to Mackenzie that we both didn't fall, because in that moment my knees gave out. "There's something in the forest," I said, and to her credit she immediately grew serious. "Did you see someone?" she asked, scanning the dark line of trees looming over us. "No," I said. "Well, yes, but I don't know." And at that moment I didn't want to tell her what I saw, because speaking of it makes it all the more real. "Something tried to lure me into the forest," I said at length, "but I don't think it's human." Mackenzie just stared at me. For a split second, I thought she was going to call me insane, but it never came. "We need to get to the truck," she said. If she had any questions, she refrained from asking them. "No," I replied, regaining some of my composure. "It wants us in the forest. We're as good as in the forest right now." Mackenzie reasoned, "The truck is right there, we need to leave." I looked up and I could see the glint of the truck in the moonlight at the top of the hill. It seemed so close. I outran it once. We could do it again, and there'll be 2 of us this time. Once we're there, we'll drive, and we won't stop until this freak show is hours behind us. We could be in Bakersfield by morning. But no, we couldn't. Because the truck is more than a mile away, tucked away behind some hill. We shouldn't be able to see it from here. It was simply impossible. Whatever it was a good hunter, I admit. Because good hunters don't chase you with drums and torches. They come at night, and they come quietly, disguised as everything you could want. When you are in the dark, they are a light. When you are trapped, they are escape. And when you are lonely, they are company. I pushed Mackenzie away. "Why didn't you wake up when I ran into the forest?" I asked. She shrugged, and her facial expression clearly showed that she thought I was being an idiot. "You were quiet," she replied, "but you heard me when I came back." She looked me in the eyes. "I guess you were louder." There was a tense moment between us where no one spoke. Then Mackenzie threw her hands into the air in exasperation. "What use is this?" she shouted. "We need to leave." I shook my head and took a step back. "No," I said, "I'm staying here." She looked at me like I had finally gone insane, but I wouldn't budge. Mackenzie took a step toward me, and I flipped my pocket knife open and pointed it at her. She stopped in her tracks and stared at me. You couldn't say she looked surprised. So it's gonna be like this, huh? I nodded, and the two of us lapsed into yet another silence. After a while, she sat and I followed suit. She talked to me all night. At first, she tried to convince me that we needed to leave. She begged me, in fact. She talked about how close the truck was and how dangerous it was to be out here. Then, as the night dragged on, she spoke of stranger things. She asked me if I was tired, and I didn't reply. You never have to be tired again, she said. I don't just mean tonight. What will you do once you leave? Go back to your life? Work? You will be tired for the rest of your life. You will die tired. She made a sweeping gesture with her hand that encompassed the expanse of trees behind her. You can stay here forever, she said. I promise you will never be tired again. How they would gather berries for me, and how they would make me a crown of oak leaves to wear. She told me that they stitched clothes with no seams and made fabrics from the foam of the sea. I was in a trance. She painted pictures in my mind of how they would fashion me flutes and harps, and how we would go dancing through the forests during winter, leaving behind only footprints in the snow. When you sing, she said, smiling, the snows will melt and you will bring in the first flowers of spring. And even so, I did not move and I did not sleep. Finally, just before the dawn broke, Mackenzie stood. So this is it. And her voice didn't even sound like Mackenzie's anymore. A marvelous hunt comes to an end. And she bent at the waist in a mock bow before turning around and walking into the woods. You may leave. She laughed over her shoulder as she melted into the shadows, and her laugh echoed across the valley, making ripples in the water and shaking the trees like the wind. I didn't trust her. I waited until the sun was high in the sky before leaving everything but my knife, and I ran for it. I encountered nothing in the forest on the way back, but I also didn't stop to look. By the time I reached the truck, my legs were burning, and I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. I am not lying when I say I did not touch the brake pedal even once driving out of those mountains. I never looked behind me either. But the trees casted shadows on the ground as I passed them, and just before I reached the edges of foothills, I swore I saw one in the shape of a woman, and I saw it waving. I called park services at the nearest town and gave them a polished version of what happened. They searched the area and found Mackenzie's body face down in the lake, carried there by the current. I don't know what I pulled out of that stream, but it wasn't her. It might sound twisted, but I was relieved to hear the news. I had thought that maybe Mackenzie had never been there with me, that it had planned this whole trip from start to finish. I'm still in shock, but I will mourn for my friend when the time comes. I saw the stream. I knew how shallow it was. Mackenzie should not have died, but it killed her. It murdered her, and it would have murdered me. So as beautiful as its words sounded, I did not stay. It has no power outside. It lives in the forests. I will say it again, it lives in the forests, and when you see it, you will know. When someone you love just disappears, it messes with your entire life. For me, it was my 13-year-old brother, David. I loved my older brother so much. We were living in a small farm town in the Pennsylvania countryside. At that time, we were living in one of the oldest houses in town. Our house was built sometime in the late 1700s. On the night he went missing, I remember my parents weren't home that night for whatever reason, but back in the 80s, it was considered okay to leave your kids home alone. Me and my brother were both sitting on the floor in the living room, listening to the radio broadcast. My brother asked me to fill him a glass of Hawaiian punch. After I went to the kitchen and poured him a glass, he had completely vanished from the living room. I remember that exact moment as clear as day. I thought he was playing a trick on me. I played along, but when I searched every room in that damn house, not a hair was out of place. He couldn't have gone outside because I was by the front door the whole time, and the windows were sealed shut since by the previous owner. The basement door in the living room was wide open, the only place he could have gone. When I left to fill up his drink, it was shut. I was horrified of the basement as a kid because there's no electricity down there, and it literally looked like a dungeon. I yelled his name from the top of the stairs countless times, but he never answered. Even though I was 11, that basement still scared me. I remember that night, sobbing uncontrollably, and when my parents finally pulled into the driveway the next morning, I was still in tears when I told them about David. Mom and Dad checked the whole house. I then told Dad about how the basement door was wide open, and when he walked down into the basement, I remember sitting on the couch next to the basement door, hoping my dad would walk back up with David. But when Dad walked up those stairs, his face had gone completely pale. In his hands were my brother's clothes from the night before. I can't describe how horrified I was. He dropped them onto the ground and walked upstairs to where Mom was. I then got on the ground and crawled toward the clothes. Exactly what my brother was wearing before he disappeared. I sorted through them. Everything he wore that night, shirt, pants, underwear, socks, everything stripped from him. I could hear my parents' voices from upstairs. My mother then came sprinting down the stairs and got on the phone with the police. My dad ran outside and into the field. When the police finally arrived, the entire police team thought he must have gone outside and got lost in the nearby forest, but I knew for a fact he was in that house. The police officers spent weeks searching the woods and fields near our house. The police checked the basement, but said there was nothing. They closed the case about a half a year later. The entire town assumed it was a kidnapping. I knew it was something to do with that basement, but I could never get myself to go down there. After his disappearance, life continued for our family. We turned David's bedroom into a guest bedroom. I hated how my parents did that. It felt like they were trying to move on. I was unable to. Losing David was a huge damper over my entire family, something that would hang over our heads our entire lives. Mom's way of coping with the grief was just erasing all memory of him. I hated her guts for that. Every time I looked at that basement door growing up, I could feel something behind it. I remember one day when I was 16, I was putting DVDs away in the living room. I was sitting a few feet away from that door and I smelt something familiar. The smell was seeping through the cracks of the door. It was what my brother smelt like. I got up and nearly ripped that door off the hinges. I ran downstairs into the darkness. The entire room smelt like David's old bedroom. It was pitch black, but I knew he was in there. I started screaming his name. I screamed his name for hours until Dad finally came down. Dad couldn't smell it. He thought I was insane. I remember I couldn't talk for weeks after that. Nowadays, the 30-year anniversary of David's disappearance is rolling around. I can say it's been a long 30 years without him. I'm now living alone, an hour or so away from my childhood town. I had to get out of there as soon as possible. When I turned 18, I started looking toward apartments in town, and by my 20th birthday, I was out the door. My parents continued to live in that house. My mom developed stage 3 breast cancer about 3 years ago and was forced into a group home closer to the hospital. My father was given the option to move with her and sell the home, but he decided to stay there and continue farming. My mother and father had a tough relationship ever since I left the house, so Dad didn't mind the quiet. Later on, my dad fell off his tractor and broke his knee and is now unable to walk without a cane. He then moved in with Mom, then sold me the land for free and insisted that I move back into that house. I wanted nothing to do with that house. I had to pay taxes for that house on top of my own taxes. I then allowed tenants move in. They were a young couple, late 20s. Of course, my stubborn old man was angry with me for letting a desperate couple live in the vacant house. They've been living in that house for almost a year now, and they called me up last week complaining about a decaying smell coming from the basement. By that time, I had learned to adapt from David's death. I told them I'd check it out the next morning. That was the biggest mistake of my life. I woke up early the next morning and drove to the house. It felt odd driving back there. Those fields, it all felt so familiar. I tried not to think about how scared I was of that basement growing up. Fortunately, my dad finally added electricity down in the basement. I pulled into the driveway. They were both waiting outside for me. They said it smelt like something was rotting down there. I had everything I'd be needing: asbestos masks, medical gloves, eye protection. I worked as an air duct cleaner a few years ago, so I have some background knowledge. I walked into the house and headed for the basement door. I never seen what it actually looked like down there until now. I opened the door and could immediately smell it. Something was rotting in there. I turned on the light switch. Ahead of me was an empty room. It was small, looked to be about 15 by 10 feet big. This basement had been haunting me for all these years. Seeing it with the lights on felt off. The walls were stone, except for one. One of the walls stood out. It was wood instead of stone. The smell was clearly coming from the wood. The wood was rotting. I walked over, and I thought the best idea would be just to tear the whole wall down. I started tearing pieces of rotten wood off the walls. Light started to seep into the other side. There was a secret room in the basement. I stopped, and in front of me I saw what looked like human flesh. I couldn't describe how horrified I was. I would rather go to hell than relive that terrible moment. I started smashing that wall with all the force in my body until it finally gave in. The creature in front of me, just the sight of it, made me want to claw my eyes out. It was in a fetal position. The skin wasn't pale, it was white, and it looked like the flesh had been melted to the bones. The fingernails and toenails stretched halfway across the room. The worst part was that it wasn't dead, it was breathing. It was alive. "David," I said in a terrified voice. It slowly lifted its head and looked at me. The face looked completely mutated, but those eyes were my brother's eyes. It tried to speak. It tried with everything in it. That thing was my brother David. I had so many questions. How was he alive? What did he eat? How could he breathe? What the fuck happened? I kept the questions to myself. That was my brother in that basement. This whole time he's been in that fucking basement. I didn't say another word to him. I ran upstairs and out to my car. I opened up my glove box and grabbed my gun. By the time I got downstairs, David had stood up, dragging his long nails behind him. "Julian," he growled. I then shot him in the head. At the top of the stairs were the tenants questioning the gunshot. They walked down the stairs to investigate. By the time I heard them scream, I was already out the door and backing out of their driveway. I didn't shoot David because I was scared of him. I shot him because of how awful the situation was. That was 2 days ago. I've been driving ever since. The only time I stopped was to fill my gas tank. I don't know where the hell I am. Last time I checked, it said I was in Kansas. I don't know what to do. Should I join Davis in the afterlife, or should I try to move on? The most sickening thing is not knowing what happened. What the fuck happened? I keep asking myself. Kids can say the dumbest shit. Don't get me wrong. I would die for my 5-year-old son. I love him more than I love myself. But that doesn't make his commentary any more meaningful. Any parent who's had to explain why jelly beans can't go in the toaster will comprehend. Every parent who's had to clean melted jelly beans out of the toaster will empathize. So, Daddy, there's something scary under the bed. Had gotten old long before my wife and I loaded Liam into the car to begin the 2-day trip to her parents' house for Thanksgiving. "It's your turn," I mumbled to Stacy as I rolled over on the pull-out bed. "Last time, I had to clean an entire bottle of Gatorade pee," she huffed. "That counts for 2. Besides, he called for you." She pushed me to the edge of the uncomfortable bed. Sighing, I stood up and shambled over to the minuscule twin bed on the other side of the room and sat down on the mattress. "Liam, do you remember that I need a good night's sleep so I won't crash the car while I'm driving tomorrow?" I said. "But something's moving under the mattress," he whispered in a voice that was inappropriately dramatic. I rubbed my eyes before trying to focus on Liam's silhouette in the faint moonlight. Matt's one of my best friends from college, and he's being very generous to let us stay in his house. I'm sure he gave us a room without any monsters in it. That usually calms him down. Usually, but not always. This was one of those not always moments. Liam wheezed like he was finishing the final stretch of the Boston Marathon, which meant that I could either check under the bed for potential threats or spend the next 30 minutes mopping up piss. "The tapping is coming from beneath my pillow. Check that part of the bed first," he gasped. "I'll be honest, That part made my hair stand up just a little as I got to my hands and knees. "Okay, Liam," I announced as I lifted the edge of his sheet. "I'm sticking my head underneath the bed right now and damn, it stank. What was Matt keeping under here?" I blinked, struggling to see in a space where the moonlight barely reached. The first thing I recognized was the eye. It stared at me, just inches away from my nose. I really didn't want to move because that would mean accepting what I was seeing as real. The hand on my wrist forced me into action. Her grip was slimy and gritty, and it left a cold, wet, and copper-smelling residue on my skin. I pulled away and scrambled to my feet, very angry with gravity for confusing me. I'll admit that a tiny, selfish part of my brain contemplated running away from Liam and heading out the door, but I ignored the thought and leapt forward, scooping my son from the bed and turning around. It was enough time for a clammy hand to find my ankle. This time, her grip felt like ice. But I broke away and stumbled to the pull-out bed, crashing onto Stacy as Liam screamed. That was enough to get her from asleep to fully standing in a quarter of a second. "Dave," she gasped, "what are you?" She didn't need to finish. The woman now crawling out from beneath Liam's bed was visible even in the dim moonlight. It was my turn for an inappropriate piss as I realized that she was standing between us and the only door. Still urinating, I grabbed my son in one arm and my wife in the other and ran for the window. We had just enough time to crawl onto the roof before she reached us. The next couple of hours were a blur. I'd like to say that I climbed down from the roof gracefully, but I'm trying to stay as honest as possible. Without our car keys or cell phones, we had to pound on a neighbor's door until they woke up. The police arrived faster than answers did. Matt was taken away in handcuffs, and the woman was taken away in an ambulance. The truth eventually found its way to us. Matt had been kidnapping and torturing people, mostly women, for years. He'd pulled the tongue from the mouth of victim beneath Liam's bed, and she'd actually been begging us for help as she bled to death. She didn't survive. Matt hadn't planned on letting us leave his home with this knowledge. He'd been waiting in the hall, intending to catch us as we ran out. Apparently, capturing people in the moment of panic is the biggest thrill for him. He hadn't counted on us climbing out of the two-story window. That's the only reason we're alive. He'd already killed 19 people, and another 13 were trapped at various places within his home in various makeshift torture chambers. At first, I'd refused to believe that one of my best friends was capable of what prosecutors claimed. But that was before they showed me his notebook, which documented the grisly details of each murder. At the end of it, 5 pages had been set aside for Stacy, Liam, and me. He was going to make me choose one of them to get tortured first, then force me to watch every second of it. So that was how my Thanksgiving travel plans went awry. I hope yours played out better. I doubt Liam will be able to sleep alone until he's a teenager. To be honest, I don't blame him. He's seen the world for the worst it can be. Kids really do say the dumbest shit, but that cannot compare to the magnitude of adults who do the dumbest shit.